I wonder if you talk about what black voters
Absolutely.
appreciate. You think they appreciate the talk of a candidate who is black somehow having turned black? You think they appreciate that?
I don't think that President Trump is winning the historic margin of black voters. I know it because look at the polls. Look at the
I'm
numbers.
saying, do you think they appreciate that kind of talk? Because, who talks like that, saying, "Oh, she turned black"? Do you think they appreciate that?
I think they appreciate President Trump's candor, his honesty, and his authenticity. And Kamala Harris's campaign.
Honest? She turned black is honest?
Kamala Harris, he rightfully pointed out that her parents are Jamaican and Indian heritage. That is a fact.
Right. So she was born. She didn't turn, she didn't turn. She was born that way.
Well, her parents are Jamaican and Indian heritage. He was pointing out that fact. And black voters do appreciate President Trump's authenticity. They do not appreciate the inauthenticity of Kamala Harris and the Joe Biden administration, and they certainly don't appreciate their policies.
Yeah. Okay. So that's Trump campaign spokeswoman Karoline Leavitt, desperately selling her soul in real time, lying about Trump's racism and Kamala Harris. She is, of course, responding to this incredibly bizarre interview that Trump did at the National Association for Black Journalists on Wednesday in Chicago. I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure you've seen a lot of it. But I do want to do this little taste. Here's a taste of how that went. This is the very first question he was asked at the conference.
Questions here. Some of your own supporters, including Republicans on Capitol Hill, have labeled Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the first black and Asian American woman to serve as vice president and be on a major party ticket, as a DEI hire. Is that acceptable language to you? And will you tell those Republicans and those supporters to stop it?
How do you define DEI? Go ahead. How do you define
diversity, equity, inclusion?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Is that what your definition?
That is
give me a
literally
definition then. Would you give me a definition
DEI.
of that? Give me a definition.
Sir, I'm asking you a question, a very direct question.
Define it for me if you
I just defined it, sir. Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is only on the ticket because she is a black woman?
Well, I can say no. I think it's maybe a little bit different. So I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much, and she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She has always identified as a black woman. She went to a historically black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn, and she became a black person.
Just to be clear, sir, do you believe that
I think somebody should look into that too when you continue in a very hostile, nasty tone.
It's a direct.
Yeah. He went right to racism, questioning Kamala Harris's, Vice President Harris's racial identity and how she identifies, how she just turned black, which is remarkable since she went to Howard University as a lifetime member of a black sorority. But let's not go there. We who follow him know who Trump is. If you're a Midas Touch or any of my channels, social media, look, we follow a lot. We're very online, many of us. We always known he's a racist and a bigot. But I think it was surprising, even for me. I think I tweeted, even I'm surprised by Donald Trump sometimes. And that one was so openly racist. I think Rick Wilson said it was kind of like the senile old man at the nursing home yelling because he doesn't like the black nurse. That really was the vibe if you watch it carefully. You saw how his spokeswoman handled it. Now I want to show you how Senator Tom Cotton handled it when he was asked about that.
Tonight, in your view, are those comments defensible, Senator?
Kaylin, of course. First off, it's refreshing to see a presidential candidate who's willing to go in front of the media, something that Donald Trump knew would be a tough interview. It turned out to be a hostile, adversarial interview, but he's been doing that for 9 years.
Imagine being this devoid of ethics and morals. Tom Cotton was an Army officer like me, not as long as I was, but we both went to Ranger School and got our tabs and all those things that you do as an Army officer. And I went a different direction in my life, and I'm by no means perfect. I've certainly had my lapses in my life. I'm not proud of them. But what would drive a person like Tom Cotton, who led a multiracial, multifaceted army of some of our finest Americans of all colors, stripes, and backgrounds, to go on TV and defend the indefensible, questioning the racial identity of a political opponent? So it seemed like a good time to talk about that with someone who has thought about it even more than me. It's something I think about often when I look at those who support the MAGA movement, who used to be normal. The people like Lindsey Graham, who said, if we pick Trump, we're gonna lose everything, right? Yet here they are, his biggest super fans now. J.D. Vance, who called them America's Hitler, and now is also saying things like he thought that whole thing was, quote, hysterical. A man like J.D. Vance, who has an Indian American wife, and biracial children, thought Trump's questioning of Kamala Harris's racial identity was, quote, hysterical. So it's a great time to have someone who's literally written a book about the collapse of ethics in our politics. So I'm not going to waste any time. Let's get on with it. I am Fred Wellman, host of On Democracy, the FP Wellman. You're in the right place here in the Midas Touch Network or wherever you get your podcast. Let's get on with the show. Welcome back. I am still Fred Wellman, host of On Democracy, FP Wellman, right here in the Midas Touch Network, wherever you get your podcast, on Democracy Podcast YouTube channel, everywhere you can find it. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and the like button and the share button. All those buttons, make those things happen. We love having you here. It has just been the craziest damn week, and I probably say that every week. I think I do say that every week, right, Matt? It is always crazy, but this was especially crazy. And as I showed in those opening clips, I guess the Republicans have decided racism is the play. But what I found fascinating in this, and I always do find fascinating, as I mentioned in the opening, is the ethical side of this. Like, what makes a person sell their soul for somebody like Donald Trump or for power or for politics? I've been talking to him for a while on his agent. He's got a great book. So I want to get longtime Democratic attorney Bob Bauer. It seemed like a great time to talk about this important aspect of politics. Bob has been involved in many of the biggest political struggles in the last, 5 decades, from post-Watergate 1970s right through the Biden administration taking office. His new book talks about his journey and is a treatise on ethics and politics called The Unraveling: Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis. Bob, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I open with a set of videos stemming from Donald Trump's bizarre appearance at the National Association of Black Journalists Conference on Wednesday. And what struck me is how the party and campaign surrogates kind of leaped to his defense, right, and offered vapid and ridiculous excuses. And I'm reading your book at the same time, right, and it was just interesting to me your book. It offered a real time example of politics without ethics. And how dangerous with your 50 years in this book and life, how dangerous is this moment in that this lack of ethics as we approach this next election? You think
it's very dangerous. We've seen an open assault on democratic norms and practices and institutions. And what really distinguishes it from other periods of peril, I think, for example, Nixon administration and Watergate, is that in the 1970s, Richard Nixon and those who were involved with him in that scandal professed to care about those institutions. They would deny that they were lying. They would deny that they wanted independent law enforcement. What we have with Donald Trump is an outright frontal attack on those very norms, on those very assumptions. It's completely different in that sense. Yeah. And you point out that there are people in his party who will just simply snap to attention and reaffirm his falsehoods, and defend his indefensible excesses. And the question is, what do they think they owe the public in public life? They may owe their party loyalty. They may feel that Donald Trump's regulatory and tax policies are especially pleasing to them. I can't dispute any of that. But they are people in whose hands rests the vitality of democratic norms, vitality of these institutions, respect for the process, rule of law, for adversaries who are treated as opponents but not as enemies. And yet they will not rise to the moment. And that is very dangerous to our democracy.
Yeah, and I love what you said there. You said something so key. What do they owe the public? And it does seem like that term public service has lost its meaning. And you talk about that in the book, right? It's like, it does seem like so many, and that's the challenge with the industry of politics. And you touch on the industry of politics quite a bit in your discussion. I have these conversations with friends a lot because I'm in that industry. I admit it. I'm a political consultant myself. I'm a general counsel. I think that's the challenge, right? Is where does the line between public service and personal service and party service get blurred? And do you think it's been an arc, or has it always been there?
Well, we definitely have had periods of what I call illiberalism and horribly lapsed ethics in public life. Certainly true. 19th century had members of Congress on the payroll of the railroads. There are certainly some dark moments in American democracy. But right now, I think we have to be alert to precisely what you say, which is whether we're talking about lawyers or speechwriters or campaign strategists or whatever, they recognize that they have, yes, a party to represent, a client to represent, a candidate to support, but the public looks to them to behave at the end of the day in responsible fashion. There's plenty of room within those parameters for them to conduct hard-charging politics. Politics is a tough business.
Yeah.
The arguments are going to be made. Sometimes they're unfair, but there have to be limits. And when the moment those limits are breached, we bring what we treasure most in the democracy very much into peril. A good example being the current election denialism movement in the Republican Party.
Right. Right. And that's funny. You discussed the events in 2020 and you caution us about believing the guardrails will hold next time. Right. Well, we're just we're 3 months out the next election. Do you see, you just kind of mentioned, you see similar strategies at play for the Trump administration campaign and all, right? The guardrails, a lot of us worry that they learned lessons last time, not cautions. Does that make sense? Do you see that developing?
Yes.
And you mentioned it briefly. Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely worried. What went from Donald Trump's basically belief that he could never lose unless his opponent cheated has transformed into basically a plank in the Republican Party platform, election denialism, just a refusal to accept elections that don't go the way you want them to go. Nothing could be more fundamental to our expectations about our shared democratic life. Yeah. It's fundamental to the culture that we have to have as a democracy to support these institutions and norms. And we now have a Republican Party and their allies who are not only looking to make voting unreasonably difficult. Yes, states have to protect against fraud, but at the same time, we want voting to be accessible to the eligible voters who ultimately on election day, whenever they are voting, election day, early voting or whatever, have that one moment in our democracy when they're in charge.
Yeah. And
throwing obstacles in their path and looking to make it as difficult for them as possible is antithetical to fundamental democratic ideals. And then beyond that, laying down landmines that they hope to potentially explode after the election if they lose.
Right.
So part of it is making the vote harder now. Part of it is laying the groundwork for a challenge to the election afterward. An entire political party is thinking that way about electoral competition. That's historic and it's extraordinary.
Are we ready? I know you're not in the administration right now. But you do live in D.C. You're a professor of this for a living. You've written the book. Do you believe that those who are in charge now, and I don't want to get you in trouble here, are we ready? Are people that should be taking this seriously? Are they taking it seriously, or should we be sounding the alarm already?
No, they are taking it seriously.
Okay.
And let me be very open about my activities. My day job is as a law professor. However, as in 2020, and I discussed it in the book, I'm very much involved in election protection and voting rights work with the Democratic Party on
Wonderful.
a day-to-day basis. And I also, as I discuss this in the book as well, at the same time, work with Republicans on nonpartisan voter protection activities. You may be familiar with Ben Ginsburg, who worked with the Republican Party over election nihilism. He and I co-chair organizations that are dedicated to protecting election officials and having the community retain faith in the professionalism of those election officials. Yeah. We travel around the country in our Pillars of the Community program and bring those election officials together with leading members of the community who can speak to the populations in those communities, to their neighbors, and speak on behalf of our electoral process. And so in a lot of ways, we, other groups at the partisan level and at the nonpartisan level are exceptionally well prepared, but that isn't to say that anybody should take this challenge lightly. It is a serious, ongoing problem.
Yeah. Rolling Stone had an article this week, I think, saying that there's 70 election denialists and already, election officials scattered around the country in place right now who have made it clear they would, So it is a challenging time as we face it. And back to the book a little bit. You tell a lot of amazing stories. It's a really your career has been remarkable, and you've been. I joke a lot of times that one of the blessings of my military career and my private life afterwards has been that fly on the wall, or the Forrest Gump, but you are not the fly on the wall. You're like up in it. As you look at your long career as we face 2020. What are some of the key moments in your long career that paint the picture of how we have gotten here, right? So, amongst these many stories, is there a couple key points you say, oh, okay, I see in 1985? Do you know, anything, that you could highlight, you think made this path clear at some point?
Well, I say two things. If I were to talk about influences over the way I've thought about this, one is that I came out of law school right after Watergate.
Yeah.
And that was at the time an enormous shock to the constitutional system, and many were concerned that we wouldn't survive it. Right. There was a real question of what was going to happen. And there was a lot of talk, it's a complicated story, about how the system held. The courts, the Congress, ultimately members of President Nixon's own party in good conscience made decisions that were critical decisions to address this Watergate scandal, which was essentially, of course, about the complete disregard of democratic norms and the violation of institutions as one president sought to ensure his own reelection victory.
Right.
And so that was in fact, I think, fairly stated, a constitutional crisis, a testing moment. So that sort of shapes my view of a threat that we have to always be alert to. It had happened, and I was aware that could happen. I always had that very much in the back of my mind. I talk a little bit also about my upbringing. My family fled persecution in Europe. They were both immigrants, one from Austria, one from Czechoslovakia. And my father was politically very active, and he had a real sense from his own personal history, and I learned at his knee how fragile democratic institutions can be. And he embraced this country because he was astonished how durable they were, but he never lost that sense of fragility. The second influence, I would say, is that over time, I reflected on the boundary line between politics as a rough business and off-the-rail politics that has so totally lost its ethical compass that we're starting to enter into very dangerous territory, whether we're talking about respecting our adversary rather than treating them as enemies. I talk about that in the book.
Yes, you do.
Respecting the outcome of elections, respecting the law, understanding that making a political argument might involve a bit of puffery, a little bit of rhetorical excess, which is different than systematically lying to the public and manipulating the public, manipulating the electorate, deliberately foisting upon them misinformation and disinformation on issues that are critical to their making informed democratic choice. And once we start moving in that wrong direction, I think I learned by reflecting on my own career and the experiences I had, I learned that we may be setting ourselves up for more than just a bad political season, but a long-term corrosion that puts our democratic values at risk.
Yeah, and it is more than establishing the norms. I mean, one of the things I've been somewhat critical of Mr. Biden and the administration is I think there was a belief, especially in the early days of his administration, that we just reset back to normal and acted normal, that would be enough. I tell a story often. I'm not sure if I even told the show, but I think I told it recently, actually. But a friend of mine's a sociologist, and he explained to me about norm breaking, a penetration drill, they call it, where when a norm is broken, if we don't reset it back to the original line, that new point becomes the norm, right? And I worry that what you said, norms, traditions, are we doing enough to reset to norms? I think a lot of us are not. Well, I wasn't one of them, to be honest with you, but a lot of people believe, well, we're going to win when we won in 2020. That's enough, right? Just go back to normal. But I think we've all learned that you just can't go back to normal without tightening the rules or reestablishing them. Is an effort afoot to ensure that we are moving forward towards establishing, or I said reestablishing, I suppose, the norms, and then backing them, right, with rules that have pain. Like the Hatch Act. Like we all found out the Hatch Act is meaningless, right? So what's your view on that? Are we in the right way, or are we in trouble?
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, long-term reform with a view toward strengthening norms as well as giving them enforcement teeth where they're failing on their own terms,
right,
is a critical undertaking. I'll give you an example of something heartening, which was the reform effort, and I write about this in the book as well, to amend the Electoral Count Act. That was the source of all that difficulty on January 6th. And miraculously, on a bipartisan basis, Congress took this ailing, dangerous 1887 mishmash of a statute, and they rewrote it. And they rewrote it in a way that I think will serve us well in this election cycle, in the wake of, with the bitter experience of January 6th 2021 behind them. That's an example of something that is just critically important because the norms started to fall apart. We never had to worry about the statute because the norms did all the work.
Right.
Now we have to worry about the statute because the norms need a boost, if you will. They need to be juiced up somewhat.
Right.
And that is something we also need to do, by the way, and this is something else I've been very much involved in, reforming the institution of the presidency. We need an energetic presidency, as Alexander Hamilton argued. We don't need a presidency that slides into autocracy or a presidency that is so powerful and so unconstrained, its guardrails so deficient that would-be autocrats like Donald Trump are drawn to seeking the office because he sees it essentially as the political equivalent of the Trump organization that he can run single-handedly exactly as he chooses. So these are long-term, in some cases like Electoral Count Act, medium-term, critical reform initiatives.
Yeah, and I think there's another place I want to switch to. Let's do our sponsor break, and we'll come back because there's another guardrail I want to talk about. If you're like me, you understand the pain of finding out what to wear each day. I mean, most clothes I have are uncomfortable, never actually the size I really am, and not to mention how much time is wasted trying to find a good outfit. And when you do have a good fit, you can only wear it for a few hours. We have to change for an important meeting or dinner, find a new outfit. Now, everyone wants to dress well at all times because, simply put, it's a confidence booster, even for men like me. Men's closets were due for a radical overhaul and reinvention, and Rhone stepped up to the challenge. Rhone's commuter collection is the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible set of products known to man, and here's why. Rhone helps you get ready for any occasion with the commuter collection, which offers the world's most comfortable pants, dress shirts, quarter zips, and polos. You've never have to worry about what to wear when you have the Rhone Commuter Collection. With Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, Rhone is 100% machine washable, so you can just ditch it all in the dry cleaner or ditch the dry cleaner completely, put it all in your own washing machine yourself. You know, I'm obsessed with the Rhone Commuter Collection. We're on the move a lot, whether it's I'm catching a flight or I'm going to a meeting or whatever. The Rhone Commuter Collection has never let me down so far. The Commuter Collection can get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to head to Rhone.com/Fred. Use promo code Fred to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to RHONE.com/Fred and use code Fred. It's time for you to find your corner office of comfort. Check out our sponsor, Rhone. I hope you'll buy some outfits today. As I was saying before the break, guardrails. And one of the things I've talked about quite a bit in the show is that I feel like sometimes 6 people in black robes walk down the highway and dismantle guardrails all of a sudden, right? With this you're talking about presidential prank. I'm worried about the Supreme Court having dismantled this immunity ruling is so shocking in its entirety and what it says in the hands of someone like Donald J. Trump. So now President Biden, of course, has rolled. So let's start with that. Does that give you concern? Is that big a step backwards we think it is?
It actually was a complicated issue. I don't think the court executed at all well. They were attempting, the majority was attempting, to find some place for immunity to protect the presidency from attacks that would ultimately undermine the ability of the chief executive to perform constitutional functions. So they drew these distinctions between absolute immunity for certain kinds of official acts that are essentially within the president's exclusive constitutional authority, then something called presumptive immunity, where it was a little more complicated and had to be assessed under a more difficult test.
Right.
And then last but not least, unofficial or private acts. Am I happy with the way it turned out? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Do I worry about what it means when presidents with no scruples and no institutional sensitivity begin to plot around what they think are the opportunities opened up by that decision?
Yeah.
I worry about that a great deal. But I think there's a way to go here. I think Roberts wrote the opinion with the expectation that what this really means is going to get worked out over time. So it's going to be a little hair-raising in the meantime, but we can't be entirely sure about how it's going to end up.
Yeah. Well, my hair's going gray as it is, so I'm not sure how much.
No, mine is already gray. My hair is already gray.
How much work can we do, Bob?
Well, you have a ways to go. Yeah, exactly.
Well, look at that, my good Italian blood, thank God. And flowing into that, President Biden has come out with that Supreme Court reform is one of his things. There's obviously contrary. I mean, the last 4 years have shown us that the Supreme Court has kind of lost its way ethically. At least certain members of the Supreme Court have lost their way ethically between, to remain neutral and recuse themselves. What do you think of these ideas and proposals that President Biden has put out. Do you think, is it a good set of proposals? Is it a good start? Is a lot? Is it even possible to be passed? I mean, take us down that road of these reforms they're talking about. In the light of what you talk about with ethics, too.
Yes, no, absolutely. And as you know, I co-chaired the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court that President Biden put together in 2021. And we analyzed these issues and provided what he asked for, which was a so-called critical evaluation, strengths, weaknesses. And he has said that it helped inform his analysis. And the two areas that we spoke to, we didn't speak to immunity issues because that wasn't on the table at the time.
Yeah.
But in the constitutional amendment that was directed at a particular area of constitutional law and a particular Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
But we did address term limits and we did address judicial ethics. And we pointed in directions that those who support those reforms would want to go to make them effective. I have for a long time. I wrote my first piece in favor of term limits in 2005 in an op-ed I published in the Washington Post. I've a long time thought that we should have term limits. There's no possible reasonable argument in my view against it. I mean, there are reasonable people who hold the contrary argument. I just don't credit their argument as being as reasonable as they are. And that is, we have a country in which there's only one state, Rhode Island, that doesn't have either term limits for their state's court justices or alternatively mandatory retirement. It is the norm in democracies overseas that there are either mandatory retirement limits, age limits, or term limits. And that's what I meant to say about states in the United States, term limits or mandatory retirement ages. Why would we have in a democracy one institution in which those who hold exceptional power, and there are only 9 of them at any given time, can serve for 30, 40 years and more? And we've all seen what that means. It means that the confirmation process now is a bloody process, whereas term limits at least provides some reassurances. First of all, every president would have an opportunity to appoint Supreme Court justices. There would be turnover. And so you would have a good compromise between two values: judicial independence on the one hand, which you want, but on the other hand, some degree of democratic accountability. Donald Trump has appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, and Jimmy Carter appointed not a single one. Pure luck of the draw, just a Supreme Court justice lottery, if you will. That doesn't make any sense, and I don't know how anybody would imagine that it would make sense.
Yeah. I like it. It's a very, and I'm not sure I didn't realize that every state had that process except for ours. And of course there is a talk of expansion. What's your view on the expansion of it? I mean, is that the wrong way to go? Is that too much of is that like a third rail, or what do you think of expansion of the Supreme Court?
I personally, and that was a whole chapter was devoted to, the advocates call it expansion, the opponents call it court packing. Everything is in the rhetorical choice of terms. I was clear in the book. I do not favor court expansion / packing. I am worried it's a race to the bottom. There's no way in the world to stop the tit for tat once it begins. If one party does it, the other party will have to respond. Once that party's responded, then the first mover will have to respond yet again. And I think public respect for the court will completely disintegrate. You'll have huge courts and just a scramble of each party to continually even the score, if you will. I just don't see how that ends well. Some people say, well, let's just have enough justices added to compensate for Republican abuses of the confirmation process in the Garland and in the Amy Coney Barrett cases. Whoever thinks that that's going to not degenerate into, if you will, a cycle of violence, of political violence and retribution. It's not going to happen that it happens just once to correct one problem and it never happens again. I think that's entirely unrealistic.
I agree. I want to talk about, you tell a story, and it's no important thing, it's just recent happening. You tell a story of talking with then former Vice President Biden about his first race for the Senate and what seemed an impossible race against an incumbent Republican, and the faith that the party's leadership, the Democratic Senate campaign committee had in him. So you've seen the arc of Mr. Biden's career up close and personal, and now here we are at another historic moment in that career, right now that he's made the decision to step down. So do you see his legacy through that lens of having been there from the beginning? And what do you think is the legacy and the impact of the decision he made in the last 2 weeks?
I have 2 thoughts. I mean, one is generally I'm humble about predicting legacies because they get written and rewritten. The historical versions are continually revised. And
quite true.
How any story is going to be told into the future, how many decades for my children and grandchildren, I couldn't propose to know. But I do believe, speaking now from my vantage point, the best that I can do as a mortal he's had an extraordinary public career just on the facts. He was a United States Senator, a senior senator. He chaired foreign relations. He chaired the Judiciary Committee. He was an 8-term, very successful vice president, and a 1-term, in my view, very successful president, because he's chosen now not to run for re-election. I think that his defeat of Donald Trump in 2020 was a extraordinarily important moment for the country. Obviously, many Republicans disagree. I think it was, not so much because I don't think Republicans should ever have their say on public policy, but because of who Donald Trump is.
Right.
And I think that he accomplished a lot more than anybody thought was possible. He said, I can get things done. And people thought he was being maybe a little unrealistic, maybe a little sentimental about his early career, and didn't recognize how much the times had changed. But
I was one of those guys.
And yet, I think you'll agree, he's been extraordinarily successful.
Incredible.
And I think his stewardship of our foreign policy has been remarkably sure-handed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. I was skeptic at the beginning because, you know, it's funny. People like to on, you know, I'm sure you're not on Twitter much, but I criticized Mr. Biden back in like 2012, right? Because I'd been an Army officer in Iraq when he came over to visit with the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he had said some things then. It was like 2006 about splitting Iraq into 3 parts, and I took issue with it. And, you know, I thought it was, you know, well, kind of a sovereign country, sir. You know, so I take an issue. But and I was also concerned about the idea of senators and leaders, you know, going from a senator to a president. One of the concerns I always have is, you know, the Senate is a very collegial place, right? So my dear colleague across the aisle, it's all about, you know, and especially in the old days, it's all very collegial and working together. And Mr. Biden did bring that to the office. I think the first 2 years, I think there was some point there was an arc where he used to like, yeah, this isn't working anymore. But in a large sense, I think with the invasion of Ukraine, for example, you mentioned, is that's what worked, right? Was the fact that he didn't need to be the showboater. He as a senator, they work in the cloakroom to get things done. And in many ways, the success we've seen in that foreign policy issue has been very much behind the scenes. We expanded NATO, for God's sake. Who would have thought that would happen? And that was done in the very Biden way, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he likes to build coalitions.
Yeah, it's his jam.
You're right. He's very much, I think, I don't know that he characterized it this way, but I think you're right to say very influenced by the years of being in the United States Senate and trying to build bipartisan majorities for, you know, passing the Violence Against Women Act and gun control. And he did that coalition building overseas as well. And you have to have an appetite for it. Yeah. You have to know what to say publicly and what not to say, what's said behind the scenes, what's said sort of more openly on the international stage. I mean, this is a position that requires, this is a work that requires an enormous amount of skill, but also an appetite for continual dialogue to bring people who might be fighting you on an issue or reluctant to join the coalition along to finally join you in the effort. And I think he's done that exceptionally well. So it is a career, again, from my vantage point, that I think he should be able to look back on with great pride. And I can't imagine, certainly in my generation, that his presidency will not be viewed favorably.
Yeah, as my
obviously, again, I can't speak for all my Republican friends, and I do work with Republicans all the time on voting issues. I'm sure some of them would say, "Oh, don't sign me up for admiration for President Biden's domestic or international policies," but that's my view.
Yeah, but it's funny. Those are the same people who are touting the new bridge being built in their district, right? You know, from the Infrastructure Act. Remember the Infrastructure Act? There's no infrastructure in it except this bridge that we got in our you know, it's like, well, you know, I that's one of those things that I think you're right. When the lens of history may say a different shaping of it, as it does, and especially in our country's history, especially if you've got a history through Hamilton, right? You know, it's like that last act, right? The last scene of Hamilton. We're like, well, I actually did save the country. You know, and I think in many ways we'll see that with Mr. Biden. I think it's nice that it's been a tough month for him, but you're right. The arc of history is long and the memory is long. And it's a good place to go. You know, you finished, and I'm not giving away the book because it's not actually part. I was stunned. You finished with a stunning story about your father's work as a broadcaster to occupied Austria, which he'd fled. And you guys have to read the book for this just alone. You know, and this is what I wrote this down. You wrote. This was how he understood the democracy's undoing, a profound moral failure, a collapse of ethical politics, is your father's view on Austria and Germany and Hitler. Is that sort of your, I mean, and by the way, you have a call to arms there. I mean, what's your call to arms today?
Well, my call to arms is that everybody has a role to play. I see this, for example, at the local level on voting issues, on attempting to maintain public faith in the electoral process. I meet with Republicans We have an organization called the Election Official Legal Defense Network to protect election officials against attack. I meet with Republicans as well as Democrats, and I see people every day, whether they're lawyers in their community or they're local election officials. They may be community leaders in other respects. They own businesses and they're very prominent in the community. They play a role in civic affairs. They have in their hands an enormous amount of power because they lead in fortifying, reminding us all of what is important in our democratic political culture. And so the call to arms is everybody has a role to play. Everybody has a role to play in thinking about the moment at which these perfectly understandable policy conflicts and partisan disagreements have to give way to respect for the democratic process, or we're going to win a bitter victory in which, at least for some period of time, people get the politics that they want, the policy outcomes they want, at the risk of an extremely deteriorated democratic culture that they leave to their children and their grandchildren. And I think we really owe them better than that.
I couldn't say it better. And something I say on the show often is that everybody's got a role to play in some part, be it in electoral politics by stepping up for your campaign. But there is a role in holding our leaders accountable on both sides. I mean, honestly, I take great honor and privilege. You know, I was a Republican voter. I was never a Republican political consultant or anything like that. But I was a Republican voter many years, and it gives me great joy to be a Democrat when you see Senator Menendez, right, be held accountable for his acts. The loudest voices pushing for him to be prosecuted and then forced out of the Senate are Democratic voices. And that's the right side of history to be on, right, where you hold your own party accountable. As an old soldier, you know, we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice, right? We hold ourselves accountable. That's the very basis of the ethical code of that structure, and undermines everything. So I think that's great. Well, the most important question we ask in these interviews, of course, Bob, is where can folks find the book and find out more about you? Where can they hunt you down and follow you and get more about what you're doing?
Well, look, certainly, and thank you for having me on the show. And I really appreciate the way you draw attention to these issues. Of course, at bookstores, at Amazon, the book is intended to speak both, you know, honestly, that is to say, self-critically. I think we have to put every issue on the table. We have to call both parties to account. As strong a Democrat as I am, that's fine. I think that encourages Republicans to join with us in the conversation. If we're prepared to listen to their complaints, reasonable complaints, about the way we conduct our politics. But I tried in that book, as you say, to issue something like a call to action. I certainly am always thinking about, after all these many years, what it is that I can do, either within my party or outside my party, on a nonpartisan basis, to just make sure we protect this democratic heritage for the generations to come. And it is never going to be easy. The one thing I learned from my father, and honor his memory for, is at no time did he take it for granted. What he lost and regained in the U.S., he still did not take for granted here. And he was right not to take it for granted. I was a little bit more smug about it. And now I realize he was the one who was right to think it's something you have to fight for if you're going to keep it.
Well, perfect. I got nothing to add to that. Thank you so much. I hope everybody gets the book. It's a great book, everybody. I tell you, the one thing about the Minus Mighty, the folks who watch our shows, they buy books, and I really appreciate your unique voice and perspective. I was stunned by the moments you've had a chance to be a part of, and the path you've taken. So thank you so much, Bob. I appreciate your time, and good luck. Okay.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. What a great conversation. I know it's weird to take a step back from the crazy current events with all the things going on, but that's the thing about this show. If you follow me and you watch it often, I try to give you the perspectives and the backings from those voices about our democracy. That's why the show is called On Democracy. And this ethical framework that we're supposed to operate under that is in such danger with Donald Trump and the MAGA movement that now is openly racist and unapologetic about it. That is a real danger to the very structure of our democracy. And so you got to get somebody like Bob Bauer in here to talk about it. So I really appreciate that. I stand by what I said last week. We're winning. We're still winning. You see what's happened. Our Republican colleagues simply do not have a plan. I read an article in Politico this week says that the plan was to go after Kamala on immigration or something, I guess, the border. And then Trump went on that show this week and went after Vice President Harris very directly for her race, because Trump is Trump. In the end, no matter how much they try to control him, he's always going to be Trump. And Vice President Kamala Harris is up to the task. Her campaign that she's built is up to the task. We are up to the task. And that's the key for all of it, folks, right? We are the ones that make the difference. As Bob said, as far as holding your elected officials accountable, but you and I as participants in this process, look, we're down to 93 days, 92 days, I think right now. We are so close. You can do anything for 3 months, folks, but to save our democracy is what you need to be doing. And I know you've got busy lives. It's summer vacation time. Then school starts in September. There's no time to waste. Find a way to participate in this process to save the whole thing. And I can't emphasize that enough. We will win. We are winning. Now let's really win. Let's win. Let's defeat the MAGA movement by extraordinary spies. That's unequivocal. Let's win the House. Let's build our majority in the Senate. That is within our reach with the momentum and the motivation that we have and maintaining it, right? Everything is on the ballot. Abortion is on the ballot. The future of our very liberal democracy is on the ballot. So get in the fight. You see where Bob has spent 50 years in the fight and remains so today, out there going across the country, trying to help local election officials and their safety and their professionalism. That's a life of public service. It's remarkable, and I'm just thrilled we were able to have him on. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of new On Democracy, actually In the Hot Seat shows going up. I hope you'll see. We have a couple this week. We'll have a couple more next week. Got several lined up you'll love talking to. In the meantime, if you haven't heard, I have the privilege of being selected one of 200 creators invited by the Democrat National Convention to come to the convention as creators, as credentialed media. So I'll be creating content from the DNC August 19th through 22nd. We'll be doing interviews like media. We'll have access to surrogates just like regular media. We'll have access to events to report live. I will be doing a variety of things from there. We're still figuring it out because I didn't think they'd pick me up and I get to go. So I'm kind of stunned still that we got picked up for it. We'll be doing a show from there. We'll be doing content for Midas Touch. We'll be doing a lot of content for the On Democracy Podcast YouTube channel. So if you're not a follower already of the On Democracy Podcast YouTube channel, there's about 5,000 of you that already are. I would really love you if you go over there and subscribe to the On Democracy Podcast YouTube channel. We're going to be putting a lot of original content on there in addition to the content we put for Midas Touch, because there's going to be a lot. There's several Midas Touch contributors and creators going to it. So I'll put a lot of my content from there right on our channel and on my social media. Hopefully we'll do some lives. We'll do some interviews on our phones, whatever we can do, whatever I can squeeze in, as much content and information I can get to you so you understand what's happening at the DNC and maintain this momentum and this fire that we've got in our bellies. So I'm eager to see you in Chicago, or from Chicago, I suppose. And there's a lot more to come. We are just getting to the good part of this whole thing. And I'm just so appreciative of you guys being along for the ride and your support that I get when I read your comments and support we get when I see your subscriptions and your support on Twitter when all the crazies come after me. It means the world to me. In the meantime, keep up the fight. We're in it to win it, and we're going to keep on winning. We're not going back. We are not going back. Thanks. I'm Fred Wellman, right here at the Midas Touch Network. We'll see you next week.